The mystery. Nobody notices. If every nation on Earth is in debt, who is the creditor? Think about that. The United States owes trillions. Japan owes even more relative to its economy. Europe is drowning in sovereign bonds. Developing nations are locked into repayment schedules stretching decades into the future. So here's the paradox. If almost every country owes money, who exactly owns the world? Is it other countries? Is it private banks? Is it shadowy institutions? Is it someone you've never heard of? Or is the answer even more unsettling, that the creditor isn't a person, a country, or even a bank, but a system? Tonight, we're not just talking about debt. We're exposing the architecture of the sovereign debt empire, how it was built, who profits from it, where the power truly sits, and why the structure survives every crisis that should have destroyed it. And by the end, you may realize the most important question isn't who owns the debt, but whether debt itself owns us. Setting the stage, before debt ruled the world. To understand who owns sovereign debt today, we need to go back, not decades, but centuries. Once upon a time, governments didn't borrow the way they do now. Kings taxed, empires conquered. Wealth came from land, trade routes, and hard metal, gold and silver. If rulers ran out of money, they debased their coins or seized more territory. Debt existed, but it wasn't the foundation of global power. That changed in 1694. The founding of the Bank of England introduced something revolutionary. Governments could borrow from private financiers in exchange for interest and repay them using taxes collected from citizens. This was the birth of modern sovereign debt. The government no longer needed gold in its vaults to spend. It needed credibility and a lender. From that moment on, war, expansion, and political ambition could be financed not just by wealth, but by promises. And those promises came with interest. Cause and effect had begun. Governments borrowed to fund wars. Wars increased debt. Debt required more taxes. Taxes required growth. Growth required expansion. Expansion required more debt. A self-reinforcing cycle was born. But the real shift came in the 20th century. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was created in the United States. Similar central banking systems expanded across the globe. On paper, central banks were designed to stabilize economies. In reality, they institutionalized sovereign borrowing. Here's how the mechanism works. Governments issue bonds, promises to repay with interest. Investors buy those bonds. Central banks can buy those bonds too. Money is created in the process. This was the beginning of a quiet revolution. Before central banking dominance, governments had to rely on private lenders and gold reserves. Afterward, they had something far more powerful, the ability to issue debt in a currency they could create. Then came 1944. The Bretton Woods Agreement pegged global currencies to the US dollar, which was backed by gold. This created a hierarchy, with the dollar at the center. But in 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. And from that moment on, sovereign debt stopped being temporary. It became permanent. Governments could now borrow endlessly in a currency they controlled. Deficits were no longer emergencies, they were policy tools. And that's when the sovereign debt empire truly began to rise. The rise, who bought the world's bonds? Now we approach the central mystery. Who owns this mountain of debt? At first glance, the answer seems simple. Foreign governments, pension funds, insurance companies, banks, investment funds, individuals. But when you follow the money deeper, the lines blur. Take the United States. Roughly 1/3 of U.S. debt is held by foreign entities, countries like China and Japan. Another large portion is held domestically by pension funds, mutual funds, and private investors. But here's the twist. A massive and growing share is owned by the Federal Reserve itself. The central bank buys government bonds using newly created money. This means the government is effectively borrowing from an institution that can create money out of nothing. And this isn't just an American story. The European Central Bank buys Eurozone sovereign bonds. The Bank of Japan owns a huge portion of Japanese government debt. So much that it has become one of the largest shareholders in Japanese corporations through its asset purchases. The Bank of England does the same. So who owns the sovereign debt empire? Increasingly, the central banks. But central banks aren't governments in the traditional sense. They operate independently. They control interest rates. They control liquidity. They determine the price of borrowing. And they are unelected. So we arrive at the paradox. Governments appear to rule, but central banks control the cost of government survival. And whoever controls the cost of survival controls the empire. Breaking point. When the machine should have collapsed. If this system is built on ever-expanding debt, shouldn't it eventually break? History says yes, empires have collapsed under debt before. Rome debased its currency. Spain defaulted multiple times. France faced revolution after financial insolvency. But in the modern era, something changed. In 2008, the global financial system nearly imploded. Banks were over-leveraged. Mortgage-backed securities collapsed. Credit froze. Governments stepped in. But how did they pay for the rescue? Debt. Trillions in new sovereign bonds were issued. Central banks responded with quantitative easing, massive bond-buying programs. Money was created digitally to purchase government debt. The breaking point became the turning point. Instead of collapsing, the system expanded. Debt that should have destroyed economies instead deepened their dependence on central banks. Then came 2020. Pandemic lockdowns froze global production. Governments again borrowed trillions. Central banks again monetized the debt. Balance sheets exploded. Global debt surpassed $300 trillion. The breaking point didn't destroy the empire. It strengthened it, because every crisis now justifies more borrowing, and more borrowing justifies more central bank power. So what's the consequence? If governments can borrow endlessly, if central banks can create money endlessly, who pays? Inflation. Inflation is the hidden tax that funds the sovereign debt empire. When money supply expands faster than production, purchasing power declines. Your savings buy less, your wages lag behind. Asset prices inflate, benefiting those who own stocks, real estate, and financial assets. The wealthy gain, the indebted survive. The savers lose. And here's the crucial cause and effect chain. Debt issuance, money creation, asset inflation, wealth concentration, political instability, more government intervention, more debt issuance. The empire feeds itself, and because sovereign debt is considered risk-free, it forms the foundation of the global financial system. Banks use government bonds as collateral. Pension funds depend on them for stability. Insurance companies rely on them for returns. If sovereign debt failed, the entire system trembles, which means it cannot be allowed to fail. And that creates a new form of ownership. The system owns itself. Every generation proposes reform. Balanced budgets, gold-backed currencies, debt ceilings, austerity measures. Yet debt always grows. Why? Because modern economies are structurally dependent on expansion. If governments stop borrowing abruptly, spending falls. Economies contract, asset prices collapse, tax revenues decline, debt becomes harder to repay. The cure becomes worse than the disease. So policymakers choose gradual erosion over sudden collapse. Low interest rates, steady inflation, financial repression, debt rolled forward. Never repaid, but only refinanced. And so the sovereign debt empire persists, not because it is stable, but because every alternative is more painful. Look around today. Global debt relative to GDP is at historic highs. Interest payments are consuming larger portions of government budgets. Central banks are trapped between fighting inflation and preventing bond market collapse. When rates rise, debt servicing costs surge. When rates fall, inflation returns. It's a balancing act on a razor's edge. Meanwhile, wealth inequality widens. Housing becomes unaffordable. Younger generations inherit fiscal obligations they never voted for. And yet markets remain calm. Why? Because investors believe central banks will always intervene. The sovereign debt empire has built a reputation. It will print before it defaults. But here's the hidden truth. Printing is a form of default. It's default through dilution. Instead of failing to pay creditors, governments pay them in weaker currency. The debt survives, the purchasing power does not. And this pattern is global. Developing nations borrow in foreign currencies and face harsher consequences, defaults, IMF interventions, restructuring. Advanced economies borrow in their own currency and rely on monetary expansion. Different tools, same structure. The empire remains intact, so who really owns it? We return to the central question. Who owns the world's sovereign debt empire? It's not just China. It's not just Wall Street. It's not just pension funds. Ownership is layered. Foreign governments own pieces. Institutions own pieces. Central banks own enormous portions. But the ultimate owner is systemic. The architecture of fiat currency, central banking, and perpetual refinancing. Power lies not in holding bonds, but in controlling currency issuance. Interest rates. Liquidity. Market confidence. Central banks sit at the apex of that pyramid. They don't own the world in a traditional sense. They control the rules that determine who survives within it. And because governments depend on bond markets, and bond markets depend on central banks, the sovereign debt empire is less about ownership and more about dependency. 3 clear takeaways. 1. Sovereign debt is not temporary. It is structural. Modern economies are built on perpetual borrowing. Debt isn't a crisis anomaly, it's the foundation of the system. 2. Central banks are the silent axis of power. By controlling interest rates and purchasing government bonds, they determine the survival conditions of nations. 3. Inflation is the pressure valve. When the system strains, purchasing power absorbs the shock. The empire continues, quietly funded by currency dilution. A final warning: empires rarely collapse in obvious explosions. They erode slowly, trust fades. Currencies weaken, citizens grow cynical. The sovereign debt empire may not fall tomorrow. It may persist for decades. But its stability depends on belief. Belief that bonds are safe. Belief that currencies hold value. Belief that central banks can manage infinite complexity. If that belief fractures, the question will no longer be who owns the debt. It will be who survives its unraveling.